Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second briefing session of the year. This time we will be discussing regulatory evidence in the EU. Just as same as last time, we'll start with a little disclaimer that, of course, what we are showing is our interpretation of the legal text, and neither Janaki nor I are regulatory or legal experts. However, we have been working in this space for very long. Which reminds me to introduce myself. I'm Liesbet, Geris, the Executive Director of the VPH Society, and this is Janaki Raman, who is the Scientific Officer of the VPH Society. So before we get started on the actual content, some housekeeping arrangements. This is an interactive briefing session. That's our aim. So we would like to get your feedback and your participation. At the end, there's a Q&A and a discussion. You have the ability to unmute yourself and to turn on your camera. So please raise your hand to ask a question. You can, of course, also type your questions in the chat so that we can look at them and read them if you are unable or not interested in unmuting yourself. With this, the agenda for today is to give you a little bit of an introduction in the EU regulatory landscape. For those who are well familiar with this will be a repetition. For others, we hope to give you the basic vocabulary that would allow you to understand the rest of the session, to see a bit how decisions are taken and at what levels what decisions are taken. Then we will go through the in silico evidence, how it is perceived, what are the pathways to apply for regulatory approval, and what are some of the activities that are ongoing. And we will do that both for the pharma side of things, so with EMA, and then for the medical devices side of things with the EU MDR. And at the end, like last time, we have foreseen a couple of slides on the path forward and how to get engaged with these activities. So we want to talk about who is who and reflect on how the evidence is perceived. We will also look at some of the policies and the regulatory proposals that are, or the policies and the regulatory rules that are there, and the proposals that have been proposed at the end of last year. And then tell you a little bit about how to engage with the regulators. To get started, to warm up a little bit, let's do a first quick poll to see where people are coming from, what their background is. So if you could let me know what is the domain that you are working in. So the applications, I mean, if you're in academia, what are the main applications that you are working on? It seems that the vast majority indeed is coming from the MedTech side, or MedTech combined with some pharmaceutical applications. And then maybe a few people that are more involved in the regulatory and the policy side rather than any development of tools themselves. So our next question is, what type of evidence are you primarily working with? So is this in vitro, in silico, in vivo? Are those digital twins, real world data, or are there other sources of evidence that you are working with? Then the last preparatory questions, what activities in this space are you involved in? So is it more fundamental research? Is it really fundamental research but with a translational character? Are you developing in-house tools for clinical support or decision making? Are you developing products that are destined for CE marking, or are you more on the support side of things for regulatory evidence generation, or is it none of the above? Thank you very much. This makes this very interesting to see that we're across the entire spectrum of activities. Right, so on with the introduction. Who is who? I think you all know the VPH Society because you had to be a member of VPH Society to attend this this briefing session, or a member, an industry member of the Avicenna Alliance. Because the Avicenna Alliance is composed out of an academic half, which is represented by the VPH members, and the industry half that are all the companies that are involved in the alliance. And what we are community organizations that serve as intermediaries between the technical implementation people, the users, and the people that sit on the other side, so that develop the policies and the incentives to get things into the patient. And so that is our role that we try to play as a society, to make sure that the issues get translated to the policy level and that the policy gets translated to the technical side of things. So what we typically do is advocacy. So we work with different stakeholders in different sort of groups. We do different things like making publications with them, or having direct conversations with them. We participate in public consultations. The regulatory agencies, the policy actors, they try to engage the public into their decision-making process through public consultations, and then we reply to these public consultations on behalf of the VPH Society. There are parliamentary actions, so where together with the Avicenna Alliance and as VPH Society, we have been engaging with Parliament in different ways, smaller settings, bigger settings, and the latest one was in the Sant Committee, where we were able to give a presentation on excellence in science, to really introduce the topic of in silico medicine and what it can bring and how it interacts with the policy at a broader scale. And then there are finally also public forums, of course, stakeholder meetings with different stakeholders and policy events that we participate in. Okay, that you probably knew, but how is the decision-making landscape organized? In a very broad overview, and those who attended last week's session, this is a very short summary, but it's just this slide. We have the decision-making layer. There's the government, the policymakers, both at the EU level and the member states level. They make policies. There are regulatory bodies that then enact these policies. There are intergovernmental organizations that also participate in making policies, for instance, the OECD or the WHO. And then there are non-governmental organizations that are participating in this whole process, like the ICH for anything that is to do with pharma and clinical practices, and standards organizations like ISO, ASME, etc. What they do is they make rules. These rules need to then get translated into good practices. For instance, you have the good manufacturing practice, the good laboratory practice, clinical practice. You have quality systems, you have standards, and you have then also the CE mark. So when you have the notified bodies that are enacting or that are verifying whether you have followed the rules, they can then give you a CE certificate with which you can then go to the national competent authorities to get marketing authorization. There's also a dashed box in there, which is the GSP, the good simulation practice, which is not actually a practice, but we as a community proposed to have something like a GSP to get it to the level of the GMP and the GLP that really provides a go-to practice on how to get started with modeling and simulation in the context of health and care. And then obviously all these rules get translated at an organizational level into a QMS system, a quality management system, and into standard operating procedures, SOPs, that then clarify how to do different activities that the organization is doing in a way that is compliant with the sector specific and the overall rules and regulations. Okay. So then who sit in these governing bodies, especially at the European level? We have three main or four bodies. The first part is the European Commission. So they propose legislations. They also do the execution. So there's the executive part and there are the commissioners. For instance, all the directorate generals, they enact on all of these legislations, or they propose, for instance, projects, they propose infrastructures, and they do they propose legislation that all complies with the vision of the commissioners. Then this gets sent, all these proposals get verified by the people, by the member states. So there's the European Parliament, which are the MEPs, the members of European Parliament, who are elected directly by the citizens in these elections every 4 years. Then, or Fine. Then there is the Council of the EU. Those are the ministers of the member states. And then there is the European Council, which are the heads of the member states. When all these organizations talk together, so the member states, the European Parliament, which are the people, and then the legislators, which is the European Commission, then we're talking about trialogue. And this trialogue is important to get the legislations approved and enacted on. So when we talk about then the level, so below the policymakers, you have then the regulators, which then need to make sure that these rules are implemented. You have the medicine regulators, which is of course the European Medicine Agency. You also have something called HMA, which are the heads of the medicine agencies, which are the national competent authority or the local medicine agencies, as you will have in your own country. You have the Belgian one, the German one. They have they might not fully overlap with EMA. For instance, on the Belgian side, the middle on the top layer that you see, they do the medical devices and the pharma in the Belgian regulator, whereas the European Medicine Agency is primarily focused on pharmaceuticals and a little bit on devices. Then there are, of course, for the devices, there is no such thing as a European Medical Device Agency. The European Commission is there, the one that coordinates the Medical Device Coordination Group, MDCG. MDCG is the group that creates guidances based on the medical device regulation. So they translate and make certain things more clear and more practical. And then the national competent authorities for medical devices are the ones that then check and grant the approval to go to market after you receive the CE mark depending on the class of your device, from a notified body, of which there are also, again, many around but you don't necessarily need to go to the notified body of your own country. So you can go to a notified body of your choice. How does so we're now going to look at how in silico is regarded by all these organizations. First thing to then also check is where is in silico sitting in the product development cycle. What you see here is an image that was produced originally by FDA for medical devices, but a similar structure holds for pharma. So in silico can be used in all of the things that you see here, from design and ideation, prototyping, the early testing, so the optimization, non-clinical, animal, early human studies, to the design freeze, and then actually the clinical trial that you are doing up until included in the regulatory decision making. And then for the post-market, there's actually, you can draw an arrow from the post-market back to the design optimization if you want to do another design cycle. So all of these places in silico could be used or is being used by companies in their process. Now, how is it when we look at the regulatory context? How are people talking about in silico? And that's also, we would like to insist in 2 slides just on the vocabulary that is used by policymakers and by other people, because often the words that we use do not overlap with the words, or not fully align with the words that are being used by people with a different background. So what we have done quite a while ago is actually, with a whole group of people, create a white paper on the role of artificial intelligence within in silico medicine. That was at a point where everything that was done in a computer was equated to artificial intelligence. And we wanted to make it clear to the people in the European Commission that there was actually, there were other methodologies than artificial intelligence. So we presented this as a white box, black box. We used that vocabulary, where we said, well, there is those methods primarily driven by data, like AI and machine learning on the one end, and on the other hand, those that are driven by knowledge, which are the physics-based or the physiology-based models. So that was the definition. This entire spectrum was the in silico spectrum, where you have the methods, of course, that help to create in silico models using computer modeling and simulation. You have the models that replicate certain phenomena or systems by creating these digital representations of an object or a process or a situation. And then, so in silico medicine is the entirety of this experience where we use a digital representation and experimentation of biological systems in the computer. And all of these in silico always refer to whatever methodology on the spectrum. So it could be AI, it could be partial differential equations, CFD, whatever you want. Then if we look at some of the other texts that are being used, when you look at how OECD is defining AI, which is also a definition that is used by the AI office, you go from an AI system is a machine-based system that can operate with varying levels of autonomy, but it may exhibit, it doesn't have to exhibit after deployment a certain level of adaptiveness. And that means that it can infer from the input that it receives to generate how to generate outputs like predictions, for instance. Now, there is an extension of this definition. That means that machine learning approaches and other AI systems do not necessarily only refer to logic-based approaches or statistical approaches, but that they can also include more and more knowledge-based approaches. And the way this knowledge gets included is by encoding by human experts. This can be either data, this can be knowledge, so this can be medical guidelines, or this can be even symbolic representation, so more mechanistic models. So depending on how you look at this, this could encompass the entire spectrum of in silico medicine. And I think this is important to know and to further clarify, because it's not 100% clear, because in lots of legislations, it's a question, well, are partial differential equations, do they fall under the AI Act? So, and how is the MDR then looking at this? And some of these legislative texts, AI is separated from computer modeling and simulation. In some cases, they're talking about in silico. So this is just to say that it's always important when you engage with regulators that you clarify the definitions that you use. So with that, there was some questions before I pass it on to Janaki. 2 more slides to talk about how in silico methods are currently reviewed or looked at in the context of medical devices and of pharma. Starting with pharma, the primary way in silico is used in pharma and ATMP, so advanced therapeutic medicinal products, is to generate evidence. So as a methodology to generate additional evidence for the development, approval, and surveillance of medicines. There is also a secondary one where, for instance, in silico can be a tool or a medical device that is then used in clinical trials, digital therapeutics, so that there is a combination of the drug with the tool or the device. The pathways for this would be that you go to the European Medicine Agency at the European level to get medicine marketing authorization. So where you have used in silico evidence in the primary goal as a part of getting marketing authorization for your drug. You can also go specifically for your in silico tool to get qualification advice. But where you present an in silico platform or a method or data that you will be using in the future to generate regulatory evidence, and you want to go to the regulator to show them this and so that they can have a look at it. But it's very clear that they only want to see this when you are really going to use this, when there is a clear path to the use in actual applications. And then finally, there are the digital or the digital biomarkers or the biomarkers in general, where you can predict endpoints or you have additional endpoints that you can generate for clinical trials. So those are ways in which models can be, or you can engage with the European Medicine Agency when we're talking about in silico models and data. Now for medical devices, there also the primary goal would be to use in silico as regulatory evidence for the design, development, testing and approval and post-market surveillance of medical devices. And the secondary one is that your in silico tool actually is the medical device, either as a software, as a medical device, or a clinical decision support system to do forecasts, or as a non-medical device when it's more on the wellness side of things. So the pathways for this are, when it's the primary use, it would be to support clinical investigation design when you are submitting something to the notified bodies and then later to the National Competent Authority, or where you go for a CE marking as a medical device or a medical device software. So that's MDSW is medical device software, or software as a medical device, or AI as a medical device. Those would be the paths that currently exist in the regulatory context.
Yes. I welcome you all along with Professor Geris. So we will walk through two parts from here on how in silico evidence is perceived by regulators. Before I go further, I would like to specifically mention, as Lies outlined, that we are not experts. We are trying to capture the observations that we have picked up in the policy and the regulatory space, and we would try to present it from our personal understanding. So we are ready to learn from you alongside when you hear something that is not factually correct or something that has been missed, please point it out. With that, I would start with a brief outline of how in silico is perceived within the pharmaceutical sector, in particular at the European Medicine Agency. So we just listened to where in silico methods are used within pharma. Last seminar, we said that EMA is already progressive in sense of looking into in silico evidence as part of marketing authorization or various scientific investigations that it looks into when it comes to medicines. So long story short, there has been guidelines already out from EMA on including modeling and simulation as part of regulatory submissions, but also it is very much ingrained into the strategy roadmaps that EMA has been publishing over the last few years. Moreover, this is not just a strategy priority, but they have put it in practice by introducing the consideration of modeling and simulation as an evidence through the methodology working party, where one could go and present scientific evidence originating from modeling and simulation. Further to it, there is also international effort. ICH M15 is a specific guideline that speaks of model-informed drug development, which is also something endorsed by EMA, but also US FDA. And of late, there is also increasing presence of using qualification opinion as an instrument to present in silico methods or modeling and simulation platforms to generate future data that would eventually go into marketing authorization application. So this is where it stands. We briefly presented it in the last session. So we'll just highlight a few bits and pieces of what we have seen in the last year in this space. So to start with, on the qualification opinion, it is specifically meant for novel methodologies for medicine development. So EMA offers the opportunity to have multiple levels of interactions with them. One of that is qualification opinion. It is not obligatory, it is voluntary. It is not only for the industry, but also for scientific consortium and academia to approach EMA for a qualification opinion and advice. The difference between the two is qualification opinion is EMA reviews the evidence that is put forth for a specific context of use, be it for a method, a tool, or a data or a platform, and then suggest that the evidence that would eventually come out from that could be considered in future as a valid regulatory evidence. But it's just the opinion that comes. When you are short of those benchmarks that EMA looks up when it wants to give a qualification opinion, it provides advice or a letter of support for all those applicants where the preliminary understanding is there, but there is not enough evidence. Then EMA releases a letter of support or advice recommending that the model or a method or a platform is certainly promising, but possibly you would need to generate further evidence. And this letter of support certainly helps for the manufacturer or for the scientific or academic groups to gather further data in that space, because they now have an oversight that comes from the regulator. Of course, it's non-binding. They can certainly ask more questions when there is a formal application that comes through. But here are a few examples of such qualification opinions that has come from using modeling and simulation. I'm just picking few. There are more. If you go to the website, the slides will be shared with you later after the session, and all these are hyperlinked. So you can go read through this qualification opinions that have come or letter of supports, but also comments that has come when such opinion is being released by EMA. There is always a public consultation period where this consultation can be commented by the experts and key opinion leaders as well as from the public, and then subsequently EMA makes all these publicly available for us to learn from these experiences. Of course, what we have to know from this is, I would like to echo Lee's statement that regulators are pro this approach of coming to them early for a dialogue to understand each other, but at the same time we have to respect their mandate is not to only look at the innovation aspect, but they are more on the pro-safety, risk averse, and they want to situate the questions against a regulatory pathway that you would eventually come later in the timeline. So it is important to set right expectations for both sides, otherwise we are at the risk of burning the bridges. So it's just a word of caution or a kind of learning that we picked up from some of the experiences that we went through, or what EMA reflects back as learnings and experiences from qualification opinion, not just from modeling community, but just generally their perception as they see it when people go through the qualification opinion. Again, it's subjective, it's personal. There are differences how you see it, but this is just a word of caution that from what we observed from our experiences. Subsequently, if we see this how and put it into a context, as of today in the pharmaceutical sector, the regulator, the EU regulator I mean, is looking at in silico predominantly as a preclinical evidence. Of course, they are specifically concerned on quantifying the uncertainty that comes from our VVUQ, verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification approach. So that is their conservative approach, because as I said, their mandate is pro-safety, risk averse, and they want to see it as part of the regulatory pathway. So with that position, the community has been always trying to engage and understand these reservations, but also address the concerns that comes from the regulator. We have worked together with them, publishing a lot of position papers, conducted workshops, but also roadmaps on how best in silico evidence could become a mainstream vehicle within medicine approval and regulatory assessment. The call remains open because, as you see, it is still preclinical is what they look into, but also what regulators as of today look at is they mention the use of mechanistic modeling approaches, but then the type of modeling approaches is still very superficial. It is often PBPK or PKPD models, which they are comfortable with as part of determining the dosing when they use these models, or they are starting to appreciate more of QSP, quantitative system pharmacology approaches, but they stops it. Anything further is still an early dialogue mode, not at mainstream that we see. But at the same time, EMA is open to engage in dialogue to understand what is the specific value addition that comes from advanced modeling approaches. But at the moment, it is not obvious what other advanced modeling approaches like agent-based methods or forthcoming, but they are engaging in dialogue, and I will show some examples where this is already happening now. Second challenge that we see is we would like to see as our community the use of in silico as part of virtual trials in terms of virtual patients that could augment the clinical trials, not just to do the optimal trial design, but even go further than that. Of course, the emergence of digital twins and virtual populations that we can generate with in silico modeling approaches are prominently emerging, but at the same time, the regulator is still skeptical of how these come mainstream for regulatory decision making. So that is where it stands. So what I would like to point out is that it is still non-clinical, and pre-market consideration is what we think we can come with the use of in silico for augmenting clinical trials, not just trial design, but going further than that by substituting virtual subjects into clinical trials, what we often call as in silico trials in a community. And more importantly, what we would like to see through is that in silico should not be seen as low quality, because often within the pharmaceutical sector as well as with the medical devices, what you see is randomized clinical trials is the golden truth, which is certainly an high quality evidence, but it also has shortcomings. It's not something that is readily acknowledged by the regulators. So this is the current position of what we see as regulators' perception on in silico. If you would like to add anything, good. But at the same time, there are things progressing. I said I would like to bring some positivity. So this is just a current position from our viewpoint of how regulators see in silico evidence, but at the same time, things are changing. So one of the first observations is that they would like to move away from just reading reports. As a regulator, they want to get hold of the data. Is something that is happening whether with or without in silico. So EMA decision-making process to be driven by more data than reports. In sense, it should be informed decision making where there is solid data that they get hold of. So there are a lot of initiatives coming from EMA to move in that direction. And at the same time, needless to say, AI is getting prominence within EMA as a regulator. And what you used to see in the last years is that use of AI as part of process optimization to go through the regulatory dossiers. But now that is transforming very much into practice where for different application areas, they are coming up with use cases where AI is used. So certainly it has put into action from strategy to real implementation where EMA is looking into a network-wide use case, but also literacy within the regulatory community in the EMA space. So one such initiative is they are working together with US FDA. They don't want to do things in isolation when it comes to basic principles of AI for medicine life cycle development. So these are some trends that we saw, but there is also something very encouraging that is happening is they are thinking that what if we have to start all of fresh now, what are the different evidence sources that we can consider rather than just limit it to randomized clinical trials. So they are looking into the different evidence generation methods. Real world data, for instance, has got a lot of prominence. So to put it all, what you see is regulatory science when it comes to in silico is specifically interested on looking at non-clinical data beyond clinical trials. Of course, clinical trials will remain a main area that regulator would focus on, but at the same time, modeling and simulation as part of non-clinical data is very much in consideration within the regulatory space in pharmaceutical sector. The second AI is, I mentioned about it, the third I want to highlight is the use of real world data. Many of you would know about this initiative, Darwin, which empowers the regulators to use real world data coming from different subpopulations within Europe through the Darwin EU initiative. And they are able to, as regulators, go beyond just process the application that comes from the regulator, but able to do some studies by themselves by leveraging the real world data. So this is something we also have to take into account that these are initiatives that are beneficial for us as a community as well. Finally, I would also point out a specific area that I noticed where EMA is looking for non-clinical data and modeling and simulation as a means is looking at health emergencies. For example, in case of outbreaks or as well as some threats that we are facing in the world, then what would be the situation when we cannot do effective human efficacy trials or not feasible? There is not time or this is not a possibility. This is still early days. In those cases, what can alternative sources of evidence that can come on to empower the regulator to make an informed decision making? Of course, orphan and rare diseases also remains a focus. This is just a pick of few topics that you can see the positive entry of modeling and simulation as an evidence source within the pharmaceutical sector. The next 3 slides, I will briefly touch upon what I picked in key workshops that I followed in the last few months. One in particular where there was a 2-day enclave with focus on mechanistic modeling. There were over 100 participants, both across EU as well as US, who had come in. There was enough representation from industry, academia, and regulators. And the focus was a presentation of evidence from different modeling approach and also testing the friction that is there in consideration of advanced modeling approaches, be it QSP, agent-based models, or digital twins. So there was a very good dialogue that kept the interaction going, but this was actually preceded by a position paper that EMA is currently writing, and the reports would be more insightful for you to take a look at on how regulators see mechanistic modeling in their workflows. So the second is on artificial intelligence. So as I said earlier, it's moving from plan to practice. The main driver there within EMA is NDSG, which stands for data steering group, and they have a clear plan of where should be the priorities. This is just one snapshot of the last few minutes of the day-long session of what should be the priority when it comes to use of AI within regulatory processes. And the main call from various actors, in particular the industry, is if you do something there, please ensure that you are aligned with the global regulatory space, because this is very much important for the industry to be able to go forward. And the second, need for regulatory guidance, and third, an important shift, because the talk of sandboxes was coming quite late on the day, but became quite an important element, that EU should start looking into use of sandboxes to familiarize ourselves both about the methods, but also the evidences of disruptive technologies that will influence the medicine development or assessment. I'll speed up a bit. The last part was on the data forum that I myself attended in person in Amsterdam, where it's again an initiative from the Network Data Steering Group, where they were looking into what are the alternative evidence sources, and we were given 5 minutes to pitch on various topics, be it patient-centered data to digital twins and all the way to genomics. So then the audience were asked to vote on that, and this is a snapshot of what you saw, that they are still moving slow when it comes to in silico evidence. We are pretty much on the bottom of the rung, but there was also a good consensus among the participants that it's not this or that, rather it will be all of these or a combination of these evidence sources that will drive us in the coming years as a consensus that we could arrive at. But when you speak to the regulators in the forum, what you could readily understand is that they are keen on adopting AI as an approach, whereas when it comes to in silico, they don't see that it's the same, it's something different, or it's not now, it's for future. So I'm just putting some subjective observations that I noticed when interacting with the regulators in the space. So with that, I would pass on to Lies to sum up this work.
Yeah, so this is what Janaki explained, is how it is everything is happening in the current context, in the current legislative context. At the end of last year, in December, in the week where they released all of the documents, or this is actually the week before, where they reached, after very long negotiations, finally an end on the pharma package, where they talk about critical medicines, about supply, about innovation, and they also make a reference there to in silico. There was also an additional proposal for the Biotech Act, which is there to support the biotech industry and streamline developments in that sector. It should also, or the aim was also to clarify a number of aspects or problematic aspects from the clinical trial regulation. And in that Biotech Act, we do see a lot of references to in silico and AI, especially throughout, also for the procedural aspects, but in silico as a tool, and under this, is mentioned frequently also in the scope of new approach methodologies of our NAMs that you can find. And also in January, just recently, EMA and FDA released a news item that they had agreed on a set of 10 governing principles for good AI practice in drug development that you can find on their website. So these are activities that are ongoing, that show commitment, and that show also that probably in a couple of years' time, when these legislations go into effect, that there will be even more opportunities to engage, or a stronger mandate from the policymakers to the regulators to engage with people, with the tech developers.
Okay, now moving on to the MedTech, as most of you we get to know that are from that sector. I would try to quickly walk you through from where we initiated last week on where in silico is mentioned in MDR. So this is just a recap of the slide from last time. So the mention for in silico within the current legislation that was in effect since 2021 does not have a specific mention of the word in silico, but very much mentions the use of computer modeling and simulation as part of evidence, but there was hardly any guidance when we started off with the rollout of MDR. But slowly the guidance has started coming in. But before I go further on the direction, I would like to clarify one big change for some of the audience who might find it a bit difficult when I go further with a term called investigations. So to start with, when we speak of trials, clinical trials in particular, this is explicitly mentioned only in the EU clinical trial regulation, which corresponds to the intervention for investigating a systematic investigation for understanding the safety and performance of medicinal products, and it should be an intervention beyond a clinical practice. So trials are strictly referenced within regulatory text for medicines is a key message I would like you to take note of. For scientific publications or for the US, this is not a problem. Clinical trials means for both medicines and devices, but this is not the case in Europe when it comes to the legislative text. So for clinical studies, this is a bit broader. It need not have an intervention, but still it is very much restricted to medicinal products. So as I said already, for devices, there is a different term than trials, and this term is clinical investigation, which is heavily referenced throughout the MDR, but also in all the guidances. So whenever you are talking about clinical trials for medical devices, then the right term that you might find is the investigation, and the regulators also resonate with that. So it might be a better practice for us to be aware of this difference in terms. And when it comes to IVDR, there is another term, performance studies. But practically all the three, be it clinical trials, investigation, or performance studies, mean clinical trials, but in regulatory context, these are 2-3 separate terms used based on whether you are doing it for medicine, devices, or in vitro. It's just for the beginners, so apologies for those experts who know this black and white, but some of us are still novice in that space. I think that's the reason to clarify this upfront. So now going back to the presence of in silico within medical device spectrum. So I introduced this specific guidance on the types of evidences that you can submit for approving your legacy devices that came out in 2020. So which clarified that what sort of evidences that you could submit for getting your device reviewed by a notified body. And this is explicitly listed in Annex 3, where there are a number of evidence sources. It starts from high quality clinical data, which comes from clinical investigation of the specific device of interest on human subjects, as well as different populations and so on. So there are top four correspond to high quality clinical data, which could also come from registries. And then it goes down to up to 12. And then slowly the guidance says some of these evidences, even if it comes from human subjects, don't count as clinical data under the MDR. And then they are also tagged as low quality evidence. Of course, for this webinar, we are focusing on in silico. As I highlighted last time, we are sitting in number 11 under simulated use or animal testing, cadaver testing category, where we are often referred to as low quality evidence. What is most important in this drawing is that if you are looking into a high risk medical device, for an example, class 3 implantable devices or class 2B implantable devices, then in that case, you cannot go below 4. So you have to have only the top 4, and notified bodies don't have any obligation to say, I will make my decision by evidence number 11 and 12 is what you see from practice. So it is important to note where this notion of low quality evidence comes. This is one sort of source that we think is possibly giving rise to this notion. What is low quality and high quality evidence within regulatory procedures? So subsequently, there was a guidance on orphan devices where again in silico is referenced, and in silico as referenced as an evidence source as part of non-clinical data. So our humble understanding is that the current perception on in silico for regulatory processes within medical devices is that it's a low quality non-clinical evidence. That is the state as of today with the current MDR legislation. So again, a little bit of primer for basic audience. So where does this all come from is something you can make sense of from MDR Article 2. This is especially also interesting for academics. If you are doing fundamental research or application-oriented research for clinical adoption, this could be of relevance to you. Why am I saying that? Is that many times we think we are never going to go for a CE marking or approach a notified body. Why should we be bothered about so much about the regulations? Is a common observation that I noticed. So for those audience, just this slide would walk you through why this is also important for you, because MDR specifically lists what counts as clinical data. It specifically says that the clinical data is one that comes from clinical investigation, peer-reviewed scientific literature, or post-market surveillance data from specific buckets of sources from which it can demonstrate the safety and performance of the device. So this is strictly ingrained in the MDR. Of course, what is clinical investigation is something we already touched on. It is also detailed within the MDR, where it mentions that it corresponds to systematic investigation involving one or more human subjects, and most often with the specific device that you are pursuing for regulatory approval. So if anything doesn't count as physical human experimentation, doesn't count under clinical investigation, is my understanding from what I've followed through in the regulatory courses from both notified body experts, but also regulatory experts. So where do we then fit in is this clinical evidence. Clinical evidence corresponds to all available information in simple terms, where you could consider both clinical data, but also clinical evaluation results, by which we mean any preclinical, non-clinical sort of evidence, or even human experimentation results that you get, which doesn't qualify as clinical data, can be considered as an evidence proof, and that would come under the bucket called clinical evidence, where you will have to apprise the different sources of evidence and then say how this substantiate your regulatory dossier. So in the illustration on the right says that the clinical data is a small subset, while clinical evaluation results are much broader. As academics, as scientists, most of us, certainly today what we do would eventually contribute to evidence downstream. So in that sense, it would be important for us to know that this quality of evidence is an important element that we will have to factor in as we generate those background for the technology that we are developing. So to put it all together, when it comes to in silico evidence within the EU MDR, are we counted? At this moment, my humble understanding is digital twins, in silico trials, or digital evidence do not count as clinical data. So where do we then come in? As I said, it's under clinical evidence. So what we would need to focus on is the clinical evaluation and how in silico is as on date. Of course, it's not that it can only count as clinical evaluation results. What already has been enshrined is that we can use in silico data to inform the design of clinical investigation. This is confirmed that when you don't have the real clinical data coming from clinical investigation, notified bodies and reviewers might be open to look into it, but they cannot say that that's enough. That's the only evidence that they would look at. So in that sense, it is important to take home the message that we can complement, to inform or enrich, but we cannot substitute the conventional clinical investigations for medical devices. So with that background, sorry for the bit of theoretical part to it, where do we stand in practice is that we are a non-clinical, low quality, non-binding, because accept in silico evidence as it stands today. So that's not the reality. As we know from the community, we have been working for a long time, putting out a lot of position papers, but also scientific evidence to demonstrate that the technology is maturing. So that's what we outlined when we responded to the consultations on the MDR, that there is lack of recognition, that the conventional clinical investigations have their own shortcomings, whereas they are graded already as high quality. That means all other sources are low quality. And of course, we are now sitting in the bucket of non-clinical, which means only in the pre-market and preclinical space, whereas in silico methods are something that can be quite omnipresent and across the life cycle. The second thing is technology is maturing. There are also modeling and simulation being used within CE mark devices. So the technology has matured to that, but also the standards on modeling and simulation has prominently emerged, but this is still not widely acknowledged within the regulatory space, or the two stumbling blocks. So to put it in summary, So we would like to see that in silico goes across the life cycle, but also you don't need to go to in silico only when you cannot do clinical studies, but even when you can do clinical studies, what you can do with in silico, there should be a value in adding that. This is still a gap that is not addressed. So it might sound a bit negative, but I would like to leave you with 4 pathways that where in silico is already being considered or could be considered if you are working on in silico as a device or in silico evidence for regulatory submission. So you can follow the current pathway. For example, if you have in silico as a medical device, by which I mean you use modeling and simulation as part of surgery planning or device stratification, then you can go through the current regulatory regime. Only that you will have to produce the traditional evidence sources, by which I mean clinical investigation studies, registry data, the high quality information that the guidances and the regulation has clearly outlined. If you do that, yes, it is possible to get CE marking or you are in silico as a medical device. This is not a problem. Probably it's time consuming and expensive, but it is still feasible. It might sound like I'm just throwing words, but I can show that this has already happened. We looked at different manufacturers who got prior CE marking before the arrival of MDR. Both in US, but also in EU. Most often they started in the EU and then moved to the US, but they also went all the way up to getting reimbursements through health technology assessment for their technology across the globe in multiple places. So just some quick examples from our own community. I think most of them, I tried to do some due diligence looking into the UDAMED for their certifications if they are CE marked in current regime, and I think they are, but I'm going to also cross-check it because I have some doubts in some places, but just giving you some quick examples that it is possible to have a modeling and simulation as a medical device approved under current MDR. That's the message that I want to show with some of the companies that have already crossed the line, be it class 2A or a class 2B device. The last one's in queue is a class 2B device. Of course, the space is fast evolving, where we are already using modeling and simulation to inform clinical investigation, but there are also other products in the orthopedic segment, be it from Twinside, who have got an approved product in the US and they are interested in pursuing in the EU is what we understand, and of course MDSIM looking into clinical decision support system for orthopedic area again. And then there are more in the audience also. I see colleagues from Milan who are out there looking into in this space. I'm sure this space is going to increase where there will be more CE mark products where modeling and simulation is used within the device or is a device by itself, which is a secondary pathway that Lies outlined at the start of the session. So what else we could do beyond having a standalone device which is using modeling and simulation? Of course, we can continue to submit modeling and simulation for regulatory dossiers, but then it cannot be a standalone, but as a supporting evidence. Especially with high-risk devices, it could be challenging, but there is no risk and no pushback saying that you cannot submit it. You can, of course, submit it, but it can only be supplement. They can say they will not look at it or they don't have to look at it, but it might be still possible to get some insight. So I'm sure that the clinical reviewers in particular within the notified bodies are interested in looking at additional sources of evidence with open mind to look at what we can learn more from whatever they have at this point of time. Of course, with low medium risk devices, the possibilities are a bit more, and there are other companies which are doing this already at the moment. I think from our community, contributing to regulatory dossiers through their evidence sources for both high risk and low risk devices. Especially Article 6110 is one that you might be interested in, where it focuses on exemptions from doing conventional clinical investigation, which I mean you don't have to do human trials in certain cases. Instead, you could provide alternative evidence sources or complement with the evidence sources from non-clinical approaches, including in silico. But there are mixed observations. What you might sometimes hear is that for software, it will never count because it's often novel. It's only the one software that exists for this particular condition or this particular intended use, but there are mixed opinions on that. And also, if you don't claim clinical benefit, then this pathway is okay. No, in some cases, it is not ethical to do clinical investigation. So you can make a rationale, as what I understand from different experts within the space. There is some room where they are looking at in silico as a solution to navigate through Article 6110, where clinical investigation is not obligated. I'm pretty sure this will not be evident for high-risk devices, meaning implantable class 3 devices, but possibly low and medium risk devices. That is a way out. So with that, the new evolution is on the orphan devices, where they are more open to accept that there will be limited pre-market clinical data. So this means we may be able to open up the door a little bit to bring non-clinical evidence, by which I mean, in this case, in silico evidence can be considered as part of regulatory dossier. This is officially enlisted in the MDCG guidance, which came out in June 2024. The condition for orphan is defined as those number of patients or individuals in the EU, like 12,000 individuals in the EU. But it's not just the prevalence of the disease or a condition that qualifies your device as orphan. Rather, the condition should have either insufficient alternatives which don't work, or the device that you're proposing has a strong clinical benefit. So with those criteria satisfied, then your device can qualify as an orphan medical device. In that case, what happens is you as a manufacturer can voluntarily go to seek early advice from an expert panel, who can then look at your device designation and approve that yes, it counts as orphan device, or no, it doesn't. And then they can also comment about the necessary clinical evidence that you might have to generate. Or if you are already in the advanced stage, where as a manufacturer or as a notified body, you can seek the opinion of the expert panel in order to ratify whether the evidence that you have that might come from non-clinical in silico evidence, including in silico evidence, count towards regulatory success. So the most important part is the data from computer modeling is considered as part of regulatory evidence. But then the qualification of the device being orphan needs to be strictly adhered to, which corresponds to the presence of this condition in a specific number of individuals in EU, as well as that it brings real benefits and there are no alternatives. So this is also now only current. This is now currently only in the MDCG guidance, but the proposed revisions to MDR is also reflecting this. So when the legislation comes, it will become more official and more widely prevalent. The last of the current pathways that you could go through is breakthrough devices. This is still very recent. The guidance came as late as December 15, one day before the MDR revision proposals came. What it acknowledges is that disruptive technologies may have a lot of uncertainty, especially when they are very novel, and that there is no other alternatives at this point of time, that we need to have a unique pathway. There are similar pathways out in Japan as well as in US, but now EU is also introducing this breakthrough devices, which is called BTX. The criteria is as follows: the device has to be highly novel, and that it should have either the device itself being novel, or it should relate to a clinical procedure or application in clinical practice which has to be novel, and it should have a positive clinical impact either for the patient or for the public health for a life-threatening condition which can otherwise not be met with current alternatives. With that in account, the conditions are similar to what you saw in orphan, that the benefit is necessary and there should be insufficient alternatives. So in this case, there is proposal to also expose those developers who are coming up with these disruptive technologies to get advice. So this is part of the simplicity and proportionality and fostering innovation plan within the MDR revision, where there will be early advice for the manufacturer. So you could go to the expert panel to get designated for a breakthrough device, or if you are in an advanced stage, possibly you might get your clinical evaluation plan reviewed by an expert panel. So this is coming through with the MDR revision, similar to the orphan devices that I showed in the last slide. So these are some of the ways where in silico evidence we think could be considered or already being considered within the regulatory spectrum for medical devices. Couple of quick slides on the standards, because this is often a stumbling block. We hear from the community that there are no equivalent standards for ASME PNB 40. So standards are recommended to demonstrate conformity. Harmonization in Europe for a US standard is not straightforward. It has a unique process. So what we would like to understand from the community is if there is a reference from some of the regulatory actors that because we are in EU, we will not be able to use ASME VNV 40, then please let us know. We would like to understand this gap. At the same time, we encourage everybody to follow and favor standards because they certainly help in dialogue. In that context, we already outlined that we are working with ISO IEC on a working item that got voted successfully in the last weeks to create an equivalent for ASME VNV 40. So with that in mind, I would also say that there are other standards out in the ISO space that refer to in silico as a evidence to justify clinical design, and a new revision is happening for 18969, which is specifically focusing on clinical evaluation of medical devices, thanks to colleagues at Avichana Alliance, who have been championing the introduction of the term digital evidence and clear mention of in silico trials as part of this guidance. Of course, this is a guidance in review, but I would like to say it in a positive note that there are a number of standards now start to refer to modeling and simulation as part of evidence generation. So I think you can pass it to you.
So this is then the overview of the current situation as Janaki explained it. As was already mentioned, a number of revisions or changes have been proposed at the end of last year. There was the breakthrough technologies guidance that Janaki discussed. And then there is, of course, the MDR revision that we discussed in more detail last week in the briefing session, where also in silico is now getting a more prominent place, or appears in more locations throughout the text, and especially as a reference or as a part of the entire clinical package. So not just it's still a non-clinical evidence, but it can be part of the clinical package. So in addition to that, there was also the cardiovascular plan that was released that also makes reference to in silico digital twins and virtual human twins for the European heart or the European heart plan. With these we discussed last week on how these changes that have been proposed now need to become actually put down in the actual legislation over the next couple of years until they are fully rolled out. So if you have more questions on that, I would suggest that you go back to the briefing session or the recordings of the briefing session of last week. The next part is how to engage with these different regulatory channels. So the first one is, of course, to engage directly as an individual or an organization with these regulators. One way is through the Innovation Task Force. EMA has an Innovation Task Force where it recruits people from different working parties to come and hear your question and then listen and ask questions about the things that you propose. Many national competent authorities also have something like an Innovation Task Force. They will also allow or engage in early dialogues to plan clinical trials, and they are open for general for questions regarding evidence generation and, of course, for vigilance post-market surveillance. Then there are so these would be your local national competent authorities that then also, of course, have delegated people into EMA. So there is a direct bridge from your local colleagues to the European level. Then there are the expert panels, as Janaki already explained, how to engage with them. There is qualification opinion, there is scientific advice, and there is the orphan or the breakthrough designation that will allow you to engage directly with specific expert panels on this topic. Of course, it is important to frame this correctly, to manage expectations and to see this as a dialogue to get the conversation started. There are other, so these are some of the expert panel details. So when you have a clinical evaluation consultation procedure, a notified body is obliged to look at for class 3 implantable devices as well as class 2B active devices to go to an expert panel. As you can see here from the expert panels that are listed, they're very strongly focused on the different medical fields that we have. There's also now, due to the new the guidances that are there, there is an extension of these expert panels where you can get a clinical evaluation for orphan devices, where as a manufacturer you can voluntarily engage with the notified body with an expert panel. And this will be the revision. This will also be reflected in the EU MDR revision, where there is an expanding role for these expert panels, but also an expansion of the competencies of these expert panels. So from only the clinical, as you see here on the slide, also towards more the technical, the regulatory, and the scientific aspects. Other channels to get directly involved with regulators is through their involvement in projects. So EMA can be part of an advisory board for your projects, but they could also be consortium partner, depending on the type of project. So in some projects, it is explicitly allowed to engage with regulators as a partner, like in the same way in very specific projects, it is sometimes allowed to engage with certain organizations within the European Commission. But if that is not the case, then it is often custom, let's say, or it is what can be done is that you engage in conversations during the setting up of a project, and then they can join a project once it is established for a specific role. So there are different ways, and you can find more information also on the website of EMA, where they explain what are the different ways in which you can engage with them. When it comes to advisory boards, this is also a way to engage with US FDA, colleagues from US FDA, and notified bodies. But always in a way that is pre-competitive, so that it is not related to a very specific project that will have to be revised by them anytime soon. And that holds also true for Team Notified Body, which is an organization that represents many of the notified bodies that we have in Europe, where, and we will come back to this later on, where we have engaged with them to set up something more on a community level, so that not everybody has to, or that they do not have to engage with every project individually, because they do not have the bandwidth to do so, and we're trying to streamline this engagement process. You can also, of course, encounter regulators at their professional meetings. You have annual meetings of EMA, and here you see some of the meetings that took place in 25. These are recurring meetings, so you can find the 26 and other meetings in the calendar of EMA. What you can also have stakeholder forums where they engage with specific stakeholders. What happens with EMA meetings is they're very well planned in advance, so more than a month in advance there will be notice. You can invite, you can get invited to attend on site or online. The slides and there will be slides and reporting, and often there's also a video recording that you can attend. So you can find for the meetings of last year, you can probably find this information again on the EMA website. And what we try to do as VPH is be present in a number of meetings. Sometimes we get invited to speak on behalf of the community. Addition to that, there are also workshops on specific topics and specific thematic meetings, usually following public consultations or the publication of a paper from their side. So again, as the previous one, these are meetings that are planned very well in advance and for which information can be found. And the same thing as before, as VPH, we try to be there to provide input into the consultations and to look what is happening in those meetings. Then there are public conferences that you can attend, and there is those of specific sectors that have forums. You can have professional societies that represent or group regulators. You can have civil societies that engage in dialogues with the regulators. And then there are community meetings where the community, together with the regulators, really work on advancing regulatory science in the field of medicines or medical devices. And we, of course, cannot attend all, but with an increasing frequency, we've tried to attend some of these meetings, especially to establish these relations with individual regulators and organizations.
So in sake of time, I will go through the next few slides on pilots that we promised as part of this webinar, but you get the slides and you can go into the specifics on your own or reach out to us. So the first pilot I would like to introduce is Raman, which is coming from the console, which is a project basically working on authorization of pediatric and orphan drugs. So they would like to recognize 5 use cases and then use various sources of data along with modeling and simulation insights to come up with a tool that is then getting recognized by EMA. So that is their focus, and they are looking for feedback, but also possibly you can see the developments that are coming as in terms of quality standards that they establish, but also training that they want to introduce for healthcare professionals when they interpret modeling and simulation results. So this is the first one. The second one is one directly coming from the Commission and the EMA, which we already introduced. The scientific advice is a late development from 2023, where EMA was coordinating the expert panel for manufacturers to go to them to check on the clinical evaluation or investigation proposals in a cost-free manner. So this was a pilot that ran for almost 1.5 years, and now since February 2025 it has become regular, and the slides provide you the links of how you can become part of that as part of your regulatory journey. Orphan devices, we highlighted it already, which is following the same path as that of the scientific advice, but with a specific focus on orphan devices. The pilot is open since August 2024, and the more recent one on breakthrough devices, which offers a structured approach where you can go directly as a manufacturer. This is a proposal as a guidance, but in February 2026, we will see more tangible procedure aspects that will come out, where there will be explicit designation that comes from expert panels, but then also when you are organizing your clinical performance or evaluation, there will be support in terms of expert panel clarifying, but also national competent authorities prioritizing your application for clinical investigation, as well as notified bodies prioritizing the review and follow up in a structured dialogue manner. So these are some of the pilots that come from directly the regulators. The third one is a project like Raman. It focuses on early feasibility studies, which is a stream that is already enshrined in MDR, but often not well explored. They are currently running a pilot where you can go to them to on your own and submit an intention to participate. What do they offer is a playbook which offers templates and advice for engaging with national competent authorities and notified bodies. The precondition is that you should have planned a clinical investigation for later this year, with early feasibility study in mind, by which they mean that even before design freeze is done, if you're doing with a small subpopulation and satisfy some of these criteria, then you may qualify for the pilot. But what they also plan to do is that release all the learnings, because they are a project which want to leverage the early feasibility study in Europe, which is not well established or practiced at this point of time. The last project is Eclipse, which is an initiative focusing on how and when clinical and non-clinical data can be used. They are looking at more structured interaction with experts to understand what kind of data sources will count towards regulatory submission. They have different phases for well-established technologies, now working on active medical devices, and they focuses on doing expert interviews to find the pathway to introduce non-clinical evidence as part of regulatory submission, is my understanding. Of specific interest, they are interested to know whether modeling and simulation can contribute to that space. Finally, I'll pass to Lisa.
Yeah. So how to engage with them is also to become a member of an expert panel, because we are, as developers, we have a certain expertise. So there is an EMA permanent call that is open to join expert panels, for which the deadline is 2029. That's not a typo, that's 2029. So you have some time. There is also a JRC experts call, and maybe, yeah, so I can clarify something if there are additional questions or there is an inaccuracy here, but that call closes on the 31st of January 2026. When you receive the slides, you can click the link and you can find it there. Then, so it would be really nice if we would have colleagues that try to engage with those expert panels, because it's the best way to learn exactly how the community of experts that is already there looks at certain evidence, and it's also the best way to actually introduce the status of the field of in silico medicine. So do you represent not just your own expertise, but also basically you become the spokesperson of the in silico medicine community there. And we're of course happy to help you should there be any questions or any need for additional information. So why do we organize these briefing sessions? Not just to inform you, but also to say or to give you the message that it's really important to engage, because some of the revisions that we mentioned, some of the ongoing guidances that are being developed really depend on the fact that we show that the community is there, that there is a question from the community, and that there is a need on the side of the applicant, of the users of these technologies, or the clinicians and the patients, to get these technologies into the clinical practice, or into the regulatory stream at least. So what we are doing is have continuous dialogues with clinicians, with patient organizations, and with regulators and policymakers to show them where we are. We talk about success stories, we communicate problems that we see, and we try to engage them in co-creation activities, including in projects, and engage in pre-competitive discussions like with Team NB, where we have organized, or where we will be organizing several community meetings. And there is a specific poll for this where you can express your interest if you want to participate in the engagement with Team NB. That will be put now in the chat. So where we will have this pre-competitive dialogue on on discussing issues related or challenges related to in silico medicine in regulatory submission. As individuals, what you can do, of course, is you can engage with your local MEPs and health committees to explain what in silico means, with your local national competent authorities in their open days, in their public forums, to show what in silico can do, to ask them questions about this, to organize innovation task force meetings, and then to keep reporting to us and to the community at large your advances, your success stories, but also your problems, such as for medical devices in the form that we've just put in the chat. And you can engage in pilot programs, because pilot programs is a way this gets reported back to the Commission, so then they really see that in silico is at the point where it can engage in these pilot projects, ask tangible questions. So to wrap up, there are two quick questions that we would ask of you. So whether you would yourself consider engaging with regulatory actors or including regulatory aspects already in your work as it currently stands. Yep, indeed. So that's good. I'm presuming that some others feel that at the moment it might still be a bit too early to engage in these aspects, but it's nice to see that we also saw it at the VPH conference, that the notions of VVUQ and others are finding their way into our daily science practice. And then maybe to open the discussion, because we've arrived at the end of what we wanted to say, to open the discussion, what are some of the main stumbling blocks that you see? We'll leave this question here open for a little bit, and in the meantime, I would actually open the floor for questions. If you don't want to type anything here, we can you can raise your hand and you can unmute yourself and ask a question or give a comment, or you can type it in the chat. Money indeed is so stumbling blocks to anything. To engage with the regulators, maybe the research funding pathways, it's difficult to find money to do this, or the lengthy procedures also make it difficult on a scientific, from an academic perspective, to put into projects. So this is requiring some usually some private activity as well. But let's first go to Sarah from the JRC. Sarah Brillo, the floor is yours.
Hello, I hope this is working. Okay.
Yes.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Liesbet and Janaki, for the detailed and accurate overview that you gave. It's very useful. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that, yes, I'm from the JRC, which is the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And maybe not everyone is very familiar with what we do. I just wanted to say that speaking of getting in contact with the policymakers, we as science research institute that informs the policies of the Commission, we can act as that kind of point of contact. So, and we also, with the rules that you very well explained, can engage with projects after they are funded. And so yes, please, if you would like also to know more of what we do, or if you want to engage with us, get in touch and contact either me on LinkedIn or whatever. And thanks also for mentioning our the call to experts in cardiovascular research for our thematic review that will end this 31st of January this week. If you want to contribute to this review of models and methods, including, of course, in silico, which is very important in the cardiovascular research field, please look it up and contribute to this project. Thanks again for all your activities in this.
Thank you, Sarah. So maybe there
is one more hand raised from them.
Yeah, there was Pinaki.
Janaki, yeah.
Yeah, but maybe you could share, if you can share with us the link to the document that you just mentioned, then we will include it in the slides, and then maybe it reaches a few more people to give feedback before it is closed. Yeah,
I had a quick question. So it really was very nice to see that legacy devices and creating evidence to show for creating in silico evidence for high risk legacy devices seems like an open pathway that one can work on, isn't it? One of the slides said that one of the pathways was high risk legacy devices, and creating evidence for that. My question was regarding that. How does one frame it best when one is doing research? How does one frame it as a research project in terms of the novelty and all? I mean, creating evidence is good, but the evidence will just show that yes, what was already known is now can also be shown by in silico method. As a researcher, how does one,
well, that's a bit of a philosophical question, and it would also depend on the funding body that you are talking to, because if you're talking to people or funding agency that wants to see completely blue sky innovative ideas, this would not be the funding body that will fund this probably. But if we're talking about funding projects that are focused more on the translational aspects, or on maybe even 3 Rs, so the replacement of animal testing or things like that, or NAMS projects that are focusing on non-animal or new approach methodologies, then projects like these do stand a chance. But it really depends on the what is required from your funding body.
There is a question from Erika.
Erika asked how medical device manufacturers know which in silico methods will be accepted as preclinical clinical evidence, and who bears the burden to validate the in silico methods used to generate this evidence. Well, the generation, you are responsible, of course, for, if you want to include in silico evidence in your regulatory submission, you are responsible for credibility assessment of that. And the stumbling block, let's say, typically is that there is still insufficient knowledge of, and hence confidence in, the credibility assessment of these in silico tools and the evidence that they generate. So the verification, validation, and certain quantification, the standards, that's why it's so important to have standards around this, so that regulators, when confronted with this evidence, they can refer to a standard that will tell them in what cases, credibility can be assessed, or how assessment needs to be done. So it's a bit of a, it's an ongoing and iterative process. So you go to the regulator because they also need to be aware that this is a question that can be asked. So otherwise they will not be compelled to start looking into this and acquiring these skills. That was at the beginning, a couple of years ago, a frequently heard comment that they said, but we don't see these projects, so there are none. And then we said, yeah, but nobody will submit this because they're not going to invest because they think you are not going to improve it. So it's a bit of a catch-22. So that is why public funding sometimes can be useful. But what we do also know is that for the first, in the beginning, what will have to happen is that you need to build this confidence in these tools, which means that you need to do the credibility assessment and at the same time also give part of the tip of the classical evidence to gain to get the regulators to give them a bit more confidence. And so it's going to be an investment that we'll have to do, and the person or the organization that has to bear it is the sponsor of this of the application. How are the notified bodies ready to consider in silico data? Well, that's why we are engaging with team notified bodies, so that we reach more notified bodies at the same time. The bigger notified bodies, like TÜV is a partner of the Avicenna Alliance, which means that they're actively seeking out conversations with organizations that focus on in silico medicine. So that shows really commitment. Shiraj is here in the call. There's also notified bodies that are hiring people with specific in silico expertise. So this is something that they have realized, especially also with the uptake of AI, that this is coming, that this will be expected. Now, in order to not have to do the same thing 25 times for all the notified bodies or more, that is why we as VPH and also the Alliance try to engage with Team NB so that we directly can speak to multiple notified bodies and that they can benefit from a community perspective on what is in silico that to help with training and to help with the building of the acquiring the necessary
getting
skills.
A common position on how to handle in silico is something
Yes.
that we have internal champions.
Exactly.
In the notified body space that we are working
to avoid reinventing the wheel
Mm-hmm.
every time and getting slightly different things in all places. So on the lack of easy to follow pathways, yes, that is why a number of these pilots also explicitly have as a mandate to share the learnings. In Silico World was a project that is already over, that went with 2 products to qualification advice, and in Zenodo you can find the briefing books that were submitted and the report of how the meetings went, and that is what the other pilots also try to do. So if you can find people that can engage with these pilots, that's really useful, because then we all learn about how this is evaluated, and then you see the examples, and that will help a lot. There's a lack of attention to the topic of in silico clinical trial submissions to Ethics Commission and regulations for trial authorization. Yes, we have had discussions locally and internationally on whether that is or how and when we need to bring this. The GSP has a chapter on ethics. But most ethical committees, especially the ones looking into clinical trials at the moment, do not have any experts on in silico. So it would be difficult to bring this. That requires a whole other set of engagement activities that need to be done. But this is definitely a fair point, and this is something that has been considered, but the focus for the moment is a lot on the regulators. That's true. But we would like to, at this point, thank you very much for sticking it out till the end with us, 5 minutes plus. And we look forward to engaging with you. And maybe just a quick FYI, if you notice, the email addresses have changed. You can now reach us at vphsociety.org. The old ones are still valid as well, so the vphinstitute.org also still work. But should you not find an email from us, maybe check your spam folder to see if we disappeared in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much from all of us at VPH. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.